Mr. Men, Little Miss, All Different, a book celebrating diversity. This is a story about celebrating our differences. We are all wonderfully different and equally special. What makes you you? Meet Little Miss Tiny. Little Miss Tiny is very small. So small that she lives in a mouse hole at home farm. Little Miss Tiny sometimes wishes she was taller. Did you know she has a friend called Mr. Tall? Mr. Tall is quite possibly the tallest person in the world. Once upon a time, Mr. Tall wished his legs weren't so very, very long. But then, with some help from his friends, he realized he was perfect as he is. Though, that's another story. One of the friends who helped him was Mr. Tickle, who has extraordinarily long arms. Now Mr. Tickle was going to help Little Miss Tiny, too. One day, Mr. Tickle saw Little Miss Tiny looking very sad. "Are you okay, Little Miss Tiny?" he asked kindly. "I wish I was bigger," she replied. "I went to the park, and I'm too tiny to get onto the swing." Mr. Tickle smiled widely. "Would you like me to help?" he asked, and with a nod from Little Miss Tiny, he used his extraordinarily long arms as her very own perfectly sized swing. "That was fun," she giggled. "Do you like having long arms, Mr. Tickle?" "I love my long arms," he exclaimed. "They're great for reaching things, even when I'm in a different room. And best of all, they're perfect for tickling. They make me, me." And can you guess what Mr. Tickle did then? That's right, he tickled Little Miss Tiny. "I just wish I could reach to tickle you back," she said between giggles. "Life would be dull if we were all the same," replied Mr. Tickle, with one last tickle. "Do you have friends who are different from you?" The Mr. Men and Little Miss are all different shapes, sizes, and colors, and they have different personalities, too. Little Miss Sunshine is as joyful as a summer's day and can always see the bright side, while Mr. Grumpy is as gloomy as a storm cloud and tends to look on the bleak side. Little Miss Neat is probably the tidiest person in the world and can't stand a mess, whereas Mr. Messy is so messy that he leaves a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he goes. As you may have realized, their names say quite a lot about them, but there is much more to Little Miss Tiny than her size. "Shall we go back to the park?" asked Mr. Tickle. "Time to go on a real swing." "Yes, please," smiled Little Miss Tiny. "I also want to go on the slide and climbing frame and roundabout, and I love seeing everyone and talking to them." Little Miss Tiny may be small, but she has a big personality. When they arrived at the park, Mr. Clever was sitting reading his book in the shade. Mr. Clever enjoys learning and exercising his brain. He's a good person to talk to if you want to understand something. While Little Miss Somersault was doing somersaults across the sports equipment. She is full of energy and loves being active, the perfect person to play with at the park. Little Miss Tiny went straight over to join Little Miss Somersault. Then Mr. Tickle used his extraordinarily long arms to lift Little Miss Tiny onto the swing. With some big pushes from Mr. Strong, she was soon going higher than Little Miss Brave. "You're fearless, Little Miss Tiny," laughed Mr. Tickle. "I don't think I could ever swing you that high." Mr. Jelly looked on in horror, as he prefers to keep his feet firmly on the ground. Do you like doing different things to your friends? The world is all the more balanced and interesting because people are different. Little Miss Chatterbox likes to talk a lot, while Mr. Quiet prefers the quiet life. Little Miss Quick is always in a hurry, while Mr. Slow likes to take things slowly. What name would your family give you? Nothing is too splendid for Little Miss Splendid. She lives in a huge house surrounded by large gardens. Whereas Mr. Silly lives in quite the silliest-looking house you've ever seen. As you may know, Mr. Silly lives in Nonsense Land, where everything is as silly as can be. Their houses are very different, but suit them both perfectly. Did you know that there is a place called Two Land? In Two Land, there are two of everything, and that's where Little Miss Twins live. That day, Little Miss Twin and Little Miss Twin were at the park. They are almost as small as Little Miss Tiny. Now, the Little Miss Twins may look alike, but they are very different. One Little Miss Twin is as angelic as Mr. Perfect, while the other Little Miss Twin is very cheeky and is good friends with Little Miss Naughty. The twins are individuals. Their differences make them who they are. The friends all decided to play a game of hide and seek. Little Miss Tiny found it easy to find Mr. Tickle with his long arms, and Little Miss Somersault with her long legs. but one Little Miss Twin was particularly hard to find. Can you guess who that was? That's right, it was the cheeky Little Miss Twin. Where could she be? Little Miss Tiny searched high and low, and soon realized that size is her superpower, as she's able to get into the smallest places. She found Little Miss Twin in the hollow of a tree. It looks like being tiny isn't so bad after all, she laughed. Mr. Tickle beamed happily. You may be tiny, but you're brave and funny too. And I say that calls for double the tickles, with which Little Miss Twin cheekily tickled her too.